think second and third week of that month. There was no space, there was no patience, there was no kindness really anymore to myself, no compassion. I was just angry. I was just angry and impatient, and that was the entry cost for the profound things that followed. Then things really open up, and that's when there's this really re-enlivened relationship with life. Like once we have a genuine experience of emotion, no matter if it's sadness, frustration, anger, fear, when we have a true experience of them without resistance, we realize that they are as beautiful, maybe even more touching than joy or happiness or a felt sense of connection and love, because what we are really reclaiming, what we've previously disowned, are emotions, which is energy in motion. So there's all this energy stuck up in us in the form of sadness, anger, fear, or any variation of them, stress, depression, loneliness. These emotions are so enriching, so energizing, so enlivening, and this is probably the best word to describe it, fulfilling. Last year, I spent 1 month alone in Canada, and that month was so touching, transformative, healing, and revealing that there's a good book called Body Keeps the Score. And I really started to sense that towards the end, how there are literally tensions, micro tensions, subtle tensions all over my body, which we usually never experience in daily life. But after a month of alone time, which wasn't entirely spent in meditation, I worked the first week, the second, I worked a little bit, the third, I kind of stopped working, so I eased into somewhat of a meditation retreat. And then in the fourth, that's when it was nothing but dissolving and being, and it was a wild ride while I was in Canada. Really alone with my psychology and all the trauma that's stored in the body. I literally came up to so much that was unseen and kind of suppressed for the last few weeks, months, and probably even years. There was a time in the, I think, second and third week of that month that I got so angry, and it felt like I've never been into any of this at all, like into spirituality, meditation, waking up, cleaning up, growing up, showing up, to be in service of humanity, celebrate the joy of life together. All that stuff, right? That's been basically the number one priority for many years now. But in that moment, when that anger came up when I was in Canada, that almost completely disappeared. Right now, I can't remember another moment in my life in the past 7 years where that happened, where there was almost no difference between that path I just described and, just throwing it all out the window and just living as a complete, this is a very judgmental word, but it hits a nail on the head, a complete degenerate, right? Like just, completely going into hedonism and chasing pleasures, chasing whatever, or even living like an apathetic, and that less so. But it was anger, it was energy, right? They wanted to be channeled into something. So chasing something external, of course, is a way to do that, no matter if that's money, sex, whatever it may be. It felt like there was no space, there was no patience, there was no kindness really anymore to myself, no compassion. I was just angry. And it wasn't until later that I found a very fitting explanation for it. And I don't know if it's an official definition of samskaras, but I heard a guy or a spiritual guru talk about samskaras in a way where he described them as traumas that get released from this lifetime or previous lifetimes. And when they come up, the very feature of them is that there is no more space, that there is no more, oh, I'm the watcher, or I can hold this, I can hold space for this. But the very feature of samskaras can be that we fully live in that experience. And he experienced it when he met the hugging saint Amma, because when he got a hug from her, he was completely blissed out in a very high consciousness state. But then in the evening, after that hug, he completely had a rage outbreak, just like when he was 17 and not heard by his parents or something like that. He was completely raging, and there was no space, as though he was teleported back to that time. And that is the very feature of samskaras, so that they can be processed. And the only thing really we can do in that moment is really, because there's this wonderful idea which we might have heard before, but it can sink on a much deeper level at some point, is that the universe never gives us, or life never challenges us with something we cannot handle. It brings us right up until the edge, but we can only decide to decline it or be unwilling to face a challenge. But if we humble ourselves and fully take it as face value, that this is something that was gifted to me in this moment, or this is a challenge I can take up, then we can live up to the challenge and grow from it in magnificent ways that might not be apparent immediately. And if we can really remind ourselves, even if there's almost no belief in spirituality even more, because we are so lost in that turmoil of the mind, if we can remind ourselves in that moment, and just the only thing we have to do is allow it, meaning we don't resist it, we don't force ourselves back into something, but we also don't get lost in it. What do I mean by that? Well, in my case, that was the entry cost for the profound things that followed. And I could sense there was one intuition left, that is what I needed to go through to get back in touch with something more profound, because there's a beautiful reel I watched on Instagram a couple months ago, which said something along the lines of, we need to go through that grieving process to even be able to get back in touch with ourselves, with our relationships, with our friends and family, with nature, with life, right? Like, what is blocking us to be fully in touch in a heartfelt relationship with all of life is the grieving process we haven't gone through yet, that we resist. And that grief, of course, is one way that stuck up emotion can be released, but it might also be anger, it might be fear, anxiety. Like when and that came up later in the retreat as well, some form of paranoia. But when we go through that, then things really open up. And that's when there's this really re-enlivened relationship with life. Like once we have a genuine experience of emotion, no matter if it's sadness, frustration, anger, fear, when we have a true experience of them without resistance, we realize that they are as beautiful, maybe even in some regard, because it's newly discovered, even more touching than joy or happiness or a felt sense of connection and love, because what we are really reclaiming, what we've previously disowned, are emotions, which is energy in motion. So there's all this energy stuck up in us in the form of sadness, anger, fear, or any variation of them, stress, depression, loneliness. All these emotions are in our hearts, are in our bodies, and we simply disown them, we reject them, we don't want them, because we think they will hurt us, or that the pure experience when we allowed them would be bad. But what we may find out is that when we completely allow ourselves to experience them, these emotions are so enriching, so energizing, so enlivening, and this is probably the best word to describe it, fulfilling. Nothing will fulfill us until we can feel. Feeling is literally what fulfills us, because the lack of full feeling and energy is basically emotional emptiness, right? It's quite simple, only that we think that we only want one side of the coin. But what we mistakenly do by that is, if we only want one side of the coin, we really get neither side of the coin. Because to the extent to which we can feel sadness is the same extent to which we can feel connection. To the same extent that we can allow and feel our anger, to the same extent we can feel and allow and experience our joy. To the same extent that we can tap into and fully experience our fear without resistance, to the same extent we can tap into and feel without resistance our happiness. So that was an interesting journey, and long story short, what happened is that after that time, which lasted around 1 or 2 weeks, and it lasted so long because I didn't force myself into the retreat. Because if you go to a Vipassana retreat, for example, or a darkroom retreat, or a really tightly scheduled retreat that has one main technique, what usually happens is that focus is applied, and therefore you handle these things can't either even come up because you're so focused on a technique that you aren't this open, allowing space in which these traumas can arise, or these emotions. At some point after I got over those 1 or 2 weeks of anger and emotion and rage, which I did various different things to allow that to come up, what happened is that at some point there was an incredible amount of clarity. Insights started pouring in like never before. Like I almost couldn't keep up with the journal and talking and recording videos about it. And then there were also amazing energetic and emotional releases almost on a daily basis, which were incredibly activating. And what do I mean by that? Well, when there is a pain in your hip, for example, and you really thought that there was a pain in your hip, a physical pain, that maybe has something to do with the bones or your gut or whatever it may be, like, and then you stay with that 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And then at some point, that pain starts to flicker. And you stay with it, and it becomes really uncomfortable, and you really want to go away with your attention, but you simply openly stay with it without trying to focus on it or narrow down on it, but you're just in very still awareness of it, almost like a blank slate, a flat plate. There's just awareness of your current experience, less and less thoughts. You stay with that pain. And then it erupts. It erupts like a confetti cannon, and energy from that pain in your hip suddenly opens up, rushes into your spine, rushes up your back, trickles into your head, and it feels like little fireworks going off. Maybe a little bit of an extreme word, but you fall onto your back, laughing, almost like you're having the orgasm. It's an energetic release. You're so much more relaxed and here and present, and the pain is suddenly gone. What do you make of an experience like that? And that is one very stark example of many variations something like that can take. And there was an extreme example. I really don't want to create expectations with this, because it can start so much more subtly, so much also equally beautiful, but less bombastic, right? But there was an example, and as we delve deeper into this journey of meditative feeling and emotional processing, we'll see how easily our mind distracts ourselves from simply being with the energies in our body and sensation. Yeah, when we distract ourselves from that, where focus goes, energy flows. So there's no more energy directed towards that emotion. And when it has lower energy, it lowers its vibration, its frequency, and it goes from a high brain wave, which is a waking state like beta or alpha. It goes into theta, which is a lower brain wave, into delta, and so it slowly sinks into our subconscious mind, meaning the emotion is not gone because we took energy away from it and distracted from it, but we actually just made it sink into our subconscious mind. And the unconscious mind, where it eventually lands, is our body. And that is why the body keeps the score. And that is, I think, a very nicely working definition for trauma, because it also helps us understand how we can heal it, which is the reverse way. By relaxing deeply into our subconscious and unconscious mind and lowering our brain waves in deep relaxation, we then meet all these things again, which we have forgotten, and can then give them awareness, allow them, energize them, let them rise back to the surface, fully experience emotion until this vibration, this energy of emotion slowly swings back to the root pain, and that is what liberates us from it and heals us. And what remains is silence and clarity and unity, because these parts of emotion, these pockets of emotions we've resisted, are also tied to thoughts, which are fragments of our personality. So as we allow these emotions to come back into ourselves that we've previously disowned, we now integrate them back into us. We also integrate the personality parts back into us. And therefore our whole psyche starts to work in a whole new harmony. So previously, disowned personality parts were self-sabotaging us from our subconscious mind, from our unconscious. In the worst case, through the disease. In the best case, through self-sabotaging patterns and so-called bad habits that we can't control. But really, what we may find at some point is that we are a conscious being, and why would there be anything outside of our control, at least starting with our own body-mind? And the reason is because there are disowned parts. There are literally many parts in ourselves. There are many people, quote unquote, in us, which aren't working in harmony, right? Now, that's a whole different tangent. So, long story short, that is a theoretical model for what actually played out practically on that retreat in Canada. And what happened is that afterward, there was less tension in that area. And towards the end of that retreat, I could sense that, okay, it would really take 2 or 3 months of almost daily releases like that to get to a point where the body would be so free that the energy could freely flow through the entire system, unobstructed, and you would be over the hill, where when you come back into your usual environment where the same triggers are there, you won't fall back into the old way of being and relating. So it was incredibly painful, or there was a lot of resistance, to leaving that retreat. I wish I could have just stayed there for longer, but simultaneously I was listening to The Surrender Experiment by Michael A. Singer, which is a beautiful book, a revealing testimony, because it really pushed me to surrender, because I had already booked my next trip. I already knew I wasn't gonna be alone for the next month. I was gonna be among many people. And I really didn't want it. I really didn't want it. And I resisted it very much. And there are videos where I recorded during that time, where I was angry, where I was furious, where I was heartbroken, where I was sad and lost and just enraged, because I had finally, for the first time, gotten so deeply in touch with myself during that time alone in Canada, that I was like, holy fucking shit, like I don't want to lose this again. And I'll just put you a bit closer here. And I could see it slipping out of my hands, like water slipping through your fingers. With every day that passed, where I was no longer alone in Canada, I lost the insightfulness, I lost the openness, I lost the connection to myself. So many fruits that had previously been opened, quote unquote, through hard labor, right? Being with that anger for 1 or 2 weeks straight, which was, borderline torture. That's a very extreme way to put it, but it just goes to show that it took sacrifice to get to that point. And I was like, oh, I don't really want to do this again. I'm now here, I want to go deeper. And and in that very token, what became clear is that is the very definition of love. And it's ripping my heart apart, because transcendence is so sweet. Going on a solo meditation retreat for many weeks or months is such a beautiful thing. You can get so deeply in touch with yourself, and such beautiful things can transpire. But transcendence, the very movement of transcendence, is up and out, right? Whereas love is the very movement of the turning back and the descent. So it is the ultimate sacrifice. Transcendence is finding the highest, and love is integrating it all, where you turn back from the highest that you have found to face the pain that you have yourself escaped, right? You yourself may have escaped some part of your suffering, or maybe even all of your suffering, through transcendence. But then when you turn back and face the pain of the collective, when you turn back and meet the people where they are at, in full surrender, where you are not even trying to change them anymore, but you fiercelessly hold space, not even to try to change, but out of pure love, taking on, quote unquote, you're not taking on that pain, but being with that heart-ripping pain, annihilating pain. That is love. That is love. And it's maybe sound so twisted, or what, that's not love, but I thought love is something else. But love in this sense, where it really comes through, is when we transcend, we find the highest. And then instead of staying there in that quote unquote maybe painless state and nirvana or whatever, we descend back, turn back into samsara. And through our annihilation, when we allow that pain that then of course comes up because we are back in the world, when we get annihilated by that, we completely empty ourselves, so that we may become a channel for that very highest, because we haven't forgotten it. We can still stay in touch with it, but only if we truly integrate and go through that fire of pain. Because without it, we will lose it. And I lost it because I was still in resistance, right? I was for weeks still in resistance to not being alone anymore. It was such a, it was such a, I was so torn apart. And there's still a part of me that would have wanted to just stay there, but it has now become very clear that that was not meant to be. When we go through that annihilating pain and not resist, we first of all won't even necessarily lose the transcendent part so much, but we become a clear channel for whatever highest we have found to descend back into the world and, in a very poetic sense, unify heaven and earth, right? And that is really the highest, right? Not the high, that's the ironic part about it. The highest is not the highest. The highest is a whole. Because nothing can be higher than the whole, right? And the integration of it all. And that is true liberation. Awakening may be transcendence, but liberation is the integration.